We know Russel Wright best for the many contributions he made to interior and industrial design in the U.S. These include The American Way, a consortium of artists, craftsmen, and manufacturers whom Wright organized to produce a line of low-cost home furnishings for sale in major department stores. Eleanor Roosevelt presided over the launching of this line at Macy's in 1940. Also, Wright's Melmac, or melamine resin plastic dinnerware, received a Museum of Modern Art Good Design Award. The sets sold in the millions and were fixtures of American homes. In addition, Wright published a book with his wife entitled Mary and Russel Wright's Guide to Easier Living, and served as a founding member and president of the Association of Industrial Designers. Less familiar to us is Wright's work on behalf of the U.S. State Department from late 1955 to early 1956, when he traveled with Rami Alexander, a craft expert, and Josette Walker, a fashion designer, to Taiwan, Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand, and Hong Kong to assess the region's potential to produce handicraft items for American domestic markets. In Vietnam, Wright and his colleagues observed people making pottery, handloom textiles, needlework, baskets, silk weavings, wood furniture, and lacquerware at sites ranging from cooperatives to semi-mechanized factories, schools, and refugee camps. Afterward, Wright submitted a report to the U.S. State Department, and he published an article in Interiors magazine entitled Gold Mine in Southeast Asia about the possibilities he perceived for craft export. Wright ultimately oversaw the establishment of 3 handicraft centers in Southeast Asia, mounted trade shows and department store exhibitions in the U.S., and designed home furnishings introducing the cultural geography of Southeast Asia into middle-class American homes. If we examine Wright's activities in light of questions raised by this symposium, his trips to Vietnam, the mobility of things he collected and brought to the U.S., images and texts about Southeast Asia that he and his colleagues circulated, and handicraft objects he oversaw being produced and displayed, we note they all participated in the in-betweenness of place, characterizing transnationalism. The prefix trans means across, crossing, and between. Transnational refers to activity between and crossing national borders. To be sure, methodologically, transnationalism alerts us to activity that is international or between nations. From the mid-1950s to the early 1960s, the U.S. State Department fostered handicraft production in Southeast Asia as a means to maintain economic conditions conducive to democracy in the nations there. On the one hand, Wright's activities were part of this larger U.S. effort to ensure Vietnam meets its economic challenges and thus make the new Republic of Vietnam, quote, the proving ground of democracy in Asia, as Senator John F. Kennedy put it, and an alternative to communist systems during the years directly preceding the 1960s and 70s, decades that many Americans associate with the Vietnam War. Crucially, though, transnationalism also moves us beyond the agency of nations to people, ideas, goods, and services, crossing national borders as part of temporary and long-term situations. Using transnationalism as a methodological framework helps us to consider in what ways flows and exchanges across national borders have uneven, effects in regard to power, and to examine dynamic processes that involve, but in many ways also exceed the nation state. During the 1950s, the American government largely described its interactions with Vietnam in terms of giving aid. The U.S. Army Area Handbook for Vietnam, for example, would report that American cultural influence in Vietnam had risen steadily thanks to an influx of American educators, as well as U.S. economic aid and military assistance. The American design world considered Russel Wright one of these educators and labeled him a designer diplomat in recognition of his contributions to facilitating freedom and prosperity abroad. In my view, Wright, along with other Americans and Southeast Asians, All were participating in transnational activity that we can also understand as consumption, because they were receiving and using people, ideas, services, and goods, including material and visual culture and fine art crossing national borders as part of the larger project of US-sponsored handicraft production in Southeast Asia. At the time, American economists were studying how production and consumption interrelated. Ruth Mack explained, quote, "The economics of consumption and production intermesh. The effect becomes cause and cause effect," end quote. What Mack calls effect, or distributing and consuming culture, was occurring in and shaping the cause, handicraft production. To be sure, American business and the middle classes were targeted as consumers of Southeast Asian culture. Yet Southeast Asian artisans also were consuming culture, American culture, as well as Asian, in the very process of making handicrafts, and they were designing and making craft objects in ways that anticipated what the US market wanted, in other words, tailoring their products to its desires. This rendered Vietnamese handicraft less indigenous than already transcultural, or between cultures. In the rest of my time today, I will provide first a little more background on the governmental framework for what happened, and then discuss several thematic examples of how the handicraft market functioned in this context. First, I'll address the question of migrant refugees as handicraft workers, and then I'll move on to other examples of transcultural consumption by both Americans and Southeast Asians. Following the departure of the French, the division of Vietnam in 1954, and the founding of the Republic of Vietnam in South Vietnam with Diem as president, the U.S. Operations Mission to Vietnam, or USOM, tried to help the new republic to counter communism and attain economic stability by providing programs based in part on educating the people. Quote, "The United States is proud to be on the side of the effort of the Vietnamese people under President Diem to establish freedom, peace, and the good life," the U.S. State Department reported in 1956. That same year, Senator Kennedy explained Vietnam's significance as, quote, "the cornerstone of the free world in Southeast Asia, with an economy essential to the economy of all Southeast Asia," end quote. The U.S. International Cooperation Administration in 1956 dedicated $767 million to support personnel from government and business, helping to establish economic pathways linking America and Southeast Asia. Their efforts included working with small industries and craftsmen to raise the quality of their products and locate markets for their work at home and abroad. A Hoover Commission report in early 1955 had criticized U.S. foreign aid for not directly aiding craftsmen of so-called underdeveloped countries. In response, the State Department summoned U.S. industrial designers for help in completing surveys in different countries. Wright was one of those called into action. A crucial issue Wright latched onto in his tour of Vietnam was what he called the refugee problem. By this he meant the people who, following the division of Vietnam at the 17th parallel, left their homes to migrate from north to south before the border dividing the nation closed in May 1955. They moved south to flee the Viet Minh as part of what the U.S. government called Operation Passage to Freedom and Operation Exodus, and the U.S. distributed funds to help integrate these refugees. In his article in Interiors magazine, Wright described the refugees as, quote, "helpless Southeast Asians who, cut off from their past, look to the United States for a road to the future," end quote. Road to the future evokes a notion of progressing towards a destination and tacitly suggests American aid could shepherd Vietnam into the territory of the free world. On the cover of a report published by the Vietnamese embassy in Washington, a Vietnamese citizen has been mobilized to traverse from land laboriously being farmed manually to land already farmed with precision and supporting modern electricity. You can see the animals here harnessed versus this land. Road to the Future also invokes mobility in the US government's names for its project to move people from north to south. Passage, Exodus. Recall that a photograph of Wright published in Industrial Design implied a connection between mobility and aid for a better life. These visual conflations of mobility, modernity, freedom, and resources for and effects of a better life contrast with the immobility and provincialism the U.S. Army handbook associated with the refugees. The handbook stated, for example, quote, "The Vietnamese do not readily migrate. Their ancestor cult tends to bind them to their birthplaces, and to leave the family land remains, for most Vietnamese, an extremely serious step." Wright creatively emphasized the refugees' potential as a workforce, writing that, quote, "There are between 500,000 and 800,000 refugees in Vietnam, eager to work but with little to do," end quote. Wright sought to help attract the patronage of the American businesses and middle classes. He achieved this by turning the refugees from a potential political liability to cultural artisans ready to participate in transnational economic and cultural flows. A major contribution to the effort came from black and white photographs Wright published in Interiors, including some photos by renowned USOM photographer Henri-Gilles Zouet. Photographs evoked the homelessness of refugees from Cambodia and North Vietnam by visually emphasizing their singularity. Equally, they championed the refugees' personal industry. Photographs show refugees making baskets, hats, lacquerware and lace, weaving, dyeing cotton yarn, throwing pottery, and preparing ceramics. A comparison of line illustrations published 2 years earlier in a French book entitled Connaissance du Vietnam, 1954, with the photographs Wright published in his article, reveals how the photographs modify as well as affirm existing visual narratives of Vietnamese handicraft. The illustrations do not individualize artisans or indicate the times and places of their work. Instead, they stage them in a silent tableau suggesting timeless materials, techniques, forms, and makers. In contrast, much about the photographs Wright published seems to render handicraft artisans topical rather than timeless. The glossy pages of Interiors magazine, the graphic quality of the black and white photographs, and Wright's text referring to their homelessness associate the refugees with the American mass media and current events. A few photographs emphasize the vulnerability of the subjects with dramatic angles and chiaroscuro. Nevertheless, the photographs also do continue to promote a visual narrative somewhat similar to the illustrations in certain respects. Like the line illustrations, the photographs avoid political references. They do not suggest handicraft production has a changing history, and therefore it is not timeless or universal. Most interesting is the photograph's omission of visual references to many of the artisans in their status as refugees, living and working in refugee camps along with thousands of other people. The title of Wright's article, "Gold Mine in Southeast Asia," takes this treatment a step further. It refers to the refugees collectively as a malleable, precious element that the US government, business, and trades could mine and refine. Of interest to this paper is the endeavor would turn the refugees themselves into consumers of American culture. Quote, "Vietnam, where I expected to find little or nothing to export, is bursting with opportunities for the American importer or developer who goes there with designs and merchandising know-how," Wright wrote. A caption across the top of a 2-page spread of black and white photographs of craft workers states, "With guidance, these skillful hands can serve the decorative trades and enable designers to carry out developmental experiments," end quote. Decorative traders and designers were understood to be American. Interior readers were consuming images of refugees signifying need and labor potential. They were also taking in the idea that Southeast Asian handicraft artisans were a market for American designers' developmental experiments. Interestingly, Wright set limits on the extent to which the artisans' consumption of American culture should affect their work. He told American readers of interiors that he wanted handicraft artisans to, quote, improve their condition within their actual potentialities, rather than concentrating on an unhappy piecemeal imitation of us, end quote. In addition, Southeast Asian handicraft production should avoid modern technological production. Wright declared, quote, instead of becoming the helpless victim of industrialization, village crafts, revitalized, could play a minor, perhaps, but active part in a new kind of overall development, end quote. The call for others to maintain pre-modern craft dovetailed with UN Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge Jr.'s vision when he commented, quote, economic development should not mean disrupting old cultures, uprooting people, or throwing away the best heritage of past centuries, end quote. And it also dovetailed with a post-war American rediscovery of craft. Yet Wright's marks belie power coursing along transnational pathways. By expressing a desire to rescue authenticity out of destructive historical change, Wright demonstrated his power to determine what could be allowed to change within handicraft artisans' production as they consumed American ideas and goods. As a result of his first trip to Southeast Asia, Wright concluded that in Vietnam, handicraft production already was operating at a level close to readiness for export. He thought this would be feasible with American, quote, assistance by means of design and styling and a program of education in design and technical training, end quote. In 1957, Russel Wright Associates contracted to participate in the Handicrafts Development Program in Vietnam. As a supervisor and U.S. merchandise specification specialist, Wright would seek to, quote, increase output, improve quality, extend marketing, and provide variety, and reduce costs of village and urban craft industries, to raise living standards for large sections of populations who depend on these industries for most of their livelihood and material goods, end quote. He would also design castings in the US and work with a pottery factory in South Vietnam. Wright oversaw the establishment of handicraft centers. In 1958, Ken Uemura of Russel Wright Associates and his wife established a, quote, handicraft development center in Saigon that provided organization and technical assistance and also extended long-term loans to craft enterprises, end quote. It directed the production of handicrafts for export and organized traveling exhibitions of lacquerware and reproductions of Khmer sculpture and ceramics. The reproductions had cultural value as simulations of works of art, commercial value as things created for sale, and pedagogic value, as did the, quote, more than 200 demonstration items designed by the Uemuras that were sold there to the Vietnamese and the large colony of Americans and tourists that came through Saigon, end quote. During the fall of 1958, the center exported hats worn by Vietnamese women, along with hall and floor coverings, window blinds, table mats, basketry, and lacquerware. Beginning in 1959 August, the Handicraft Sales Center in Saigon directly sold the work of artisans and small industrialists. While Wright had cautioned handicraft artisans against producing an unhappy piecemeal imitation of Americans, through all of these programs, he actually encouraged them to adapt to American tastes. Quote, it's necessary that such products be designed for a world of which the Asian handicraftsman has little knowledge or understanding, he wrote, adopting a bit of a topsy-turvy strategy. In early 1956, when Wright returned to the United States from Southeast Asia, he, quote, started right in adapting Asian handicraft products to 20th century American usage, end quote. He believed producing handicraft for American markets meant establishing chains of production and consumption linking the US and Vietnam. Quote, we do not simply make designs expecting producers to produce them somehow and then sell them somehow. The essence of our method is the joining of a specific market to a specific production, he wrote. And continuing, quote, the best way we have evolved to have the Asian small producer make things Americans want to buy is to have Americans design the products, end quote. Thus, quote, rather than poor copies of Western goods that have no place in their life, native designers must learn the demands of the US consumer, and designers will train them to meet our methods and standards of production, so we can get people who have never seen American life to create things Americans may buy, end quote. The archives suggest Wright facilitated the consumption of American culture in Southeast Asia as part of the production of handicraft there for the US. Rita Reef of the New York Times reported this was how it worked, quote, once a product is successful here in the US, Mr. Wright acquaints the producers and craftsmen abroad on how it is used in American homes. Mr. Wright films interiors of homes, shows the well-stocked shelves of department stores and small shops, and educates artisans abroad on how their work has meaning in our homes, she reported. Among other methods used to bring out in the students a strong sense of Vietnamese design, and thus establish a design style that can be identified as Vietnamese in character, was the relay to Southeast Asian craftsmen of information relating to contemporary American design, including exhibitions such as The Magic of Color held at the Cooper Union in 1960. Ostensibly from these exhibitions, artisans would learn how to make items pleasing to Americans, yet still identifiable to them as Vietnamese. At the same time, for example, Wright was also working with DuPont Market Research to create Cambodia, a fibrolite upholstery executed both in light pastels and rich deep tone colors, in colors such as Mekong tan, Can Chao coral, Tonkin turquoise, Saigon tan, and Nanking red. The names of the upholstery colors transpose the cultural geography of China, Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam, and Burma into a palette for decorating the American middle-class home. As part of this elaborate feedback loop of production and consumption, Wright helped to build an American market for Southeast Asian handicrafts with displays at trade fairs at the New York Coliseum in 1956 and 1958. In 1958, Russel Wright Associates also launched an exhibition of Vietnamese handicrafts and art at W&J Sloan's in New York City that traveled to 11 major American department stores. While my remaining time is short, I'll just note that Wright's displays in all of these venues promoted the allure of items based not on current political and economic relations, but on their association with far-off places of mystery and exoticism. The displays, many of them, in fact, recycled photographs taken during Wright's first trip to Southeast Asia, but used them without providing any contextualizing text. For American viewers, the displays referenced a kind of cosmopolitanism, a way of knowing the world that comes from traveling widely or being exposed to cultures of many places. The tone echoed what Washington Embassy for the Republic of Vietnam was promoting in those pre-war years, quote, Vietnam is a tourist center, likely to appeal to the tourist who seeks relaxation and quiet comfort in an exotic atmosphere, and to the admirer of the arts who will find Vietnam's historical treasures an unending source of interest, end quote. The items forged a pathway for the transnational consumption of Vietnamese handicraft as part of an American practice of using cultural worldliness as a sign of status. How worldly? The New York Herald Tribune explained, quote, objects on view are typical of ancient crafts excelled in by the natives. In some cases, the natives have been encouraged to adapt proportions and design changes suited to our needs, end quote. Thank you.